I'm back from Washington, D.C. and this year's Podcast Movement Conference. Lots to report, but there are two big takeaways. First, spend more time on your analytics on Apple and Spotify. And second, your YouTube strategy is more important than ever.
And now, a look at what's trending in the podcast world and how it can help your show. It's the Jag Show Podcast.
You don't need me to tell you that in 2024, data is the new currency. One of the opening keynotes from Podcast Movement 2024 was a sit-down with Stephen Bartlett, host of the popular Diary of a CEO podcast. The analytics that go into this show are insane. They've got a CO2 detector in their interview room to measure how many parts per million of carbon dioxide are in the air. Above a certain number, the hosts and guests get tired, and they have to reset. Then, after the interview is recorded, the team employs a huge test audience. They track viewers' eye movement to tell when they're losing interest in a conversation. It's nuts. Now, I don't have the money or the time to do this type of analysis, and I'm sure you don't either. Well, what can you do? Historically, the benchmark for podcast listening is the download. It's the first question a guest or a potential advertiser will ask you. How many downloads do you have? But here's the thing. A download only tracks when an audio file is pulled down onto someone's device. It doesn't show how long, when, or even if they listened. Now, with the release of iOS 17, Apple devices stopped downloading every show a user was subscribed to. If they weren't consuming the content, Apple would stop grabbing it. This was initially seen as bad for podcasters because download numbers took a big hit, but it actually creates a better estimate of how many people are listening to your show. In fact, engagement actually was up. Wouldn't it be better to know how long people are listening? You might not be able to track their eyeballs, but Apple and Spotify will give you fantastic insights into your audience. If you log into your Apple Podcast Connect dashboard, you'll see the number of people who follow or subscribe to your show, number of total listeners, number of engaged listeners, and more. Then if you go into a specific episode, you can see what radio folks call TSL, time spent listening. This is a great way to track what content is working and what isn't. Did you have a bunch of mid-roll ads, a boring topic, a less than stellar guest? You'll see the drop-off. On the Spotify side, on the full show level, you can see starts, streams, listeners, followers, and impressions, and they explain all those on their website. And the same thing on the individual episode level, you'll be able to see where your retention and where your drop-offs are. These analytics will give you far more insight than the metric of just a download. Now that brings us to YouTube. You're probably familiar with their robust dashboards. I won't spend a lot of time on YouTube Studio, but you can see views, impressions, click-through rate, retention, how they found each video, and more. One interesting note about YouTube retention, there's more of an initial drop-off in consumption than there is on Apple and Spotify. The theory is that YouTube is much more goldfishy as opposed to podcast audio consumption, which usually is more of a commitment to the content from the start. Regardless, you better come out of the gate with good content. Now, it won't surprise you if you watch my Podcast Movement recap every year that I'm going to quote Tom Webster from Sounds Profitable. He previewed this coming Wednesday's webinar on the podcast landscape. The TLDR version is that most podcast listening metrics from 2023 to 2024 are the same, except for YouTube, which has grown significantly. Now, what do you do about YouTube? Ideally, you have video of your show on YouTube. It'll show up faster in viewers' feeds than a static image or an audiogram with a moving waveform. But it's not for everyone. Tom made the analogy of when he got in trouble as a kid, his mom telling him not to lie and make it worse. His advice is if you go into video, don't make it worse. Chances are you have a certain production standard for your audio podcast. Now, if you can't meet that minimum standard on the video side, just don't do video. You're better off to have a still image with your good quality audio with titles and show notes optimized for SEO. Again, video is ideal, but not if you're going to present yourself poorly to your audience. Now, if you are going all in on YouTube, got some great tips from a few panels on how to set up your YouTube channel quickly. They include having a featured video, putting links in your banner, adding other channels at the bottom of your homepage, titling playlists with the podcast name, having faces and topics in thumbnails, and linking to the audio podcast in your video descriptions. I've got a lot of work to do on my page. I bet you do too. Oh, and one other point on thumbnails. If you're shooting video, have you and your guest pose for a still shot before you start the interview. Easy thumbnail, done. Also, do not put all your eggs in just the audio or the video basket. Most podcast consumers will listen to a show on Apple or Spotify, but also watch it on YouTube. You don't want someone searching for your show on their preferred platform and not finding it. Have a presence on both. Okay, what about growing your podcast? Again, I will scream this from the mountaintops. Apple Podcast charts do not matter, but your search engine optimization does. The important ways to make your podcast searchable in order are name of show, your name, episode titles, and how long your show's been around. Don't rely on social media alone to grow your podcast. It's good for impressions, but do more than throw it up on your socials and pray for the best. Consider promo swaps or co-marketing with other podcasts in your genre. The easiest way to find podcast listeners is, shockingly, through other podcasts. And do little things like putting a link to your show in your email signature and Linktree. You can also pitch yourself to Apple, Spotify, and industry newsletters to have your show featured. Do you have a produced promo for your show? Radio vet Pierre Bouvard, now with Cumulus, says 50 to 60% of the effect of an ad is the quality of the creative. Context and showmanship matter. It's got to be attention-getting. Name the show and host in first 2 seconds, restate it 5, even 6 times. Finally, I leave you with a piece of data that should keep you excited about podcasting. 87% of podcast consumers are open to discovering new shows. Put the effort into preparing, executing, editing, and promoting your podcast, and you will grow your audience. And if you need help with any of that, you can find me at jagindetroit.com. Later.
The most popular ways to grow a podcast are recommendations of friends and family. So share this episode with someone you know. And for any questions you have about podcasts, find Jag online at jagindetroit.com.